Welcome back to ITE 1932 Technical Writing. I'm Nishan Silva, and today we will look at 10 key elements of a research paper, a writer's perspective. Some of the slides from this presentation were modified from the original presentation done by Dr. Dilum Bandar. This is the color coding that we will be using for this lecture and all the subsequent lectures. Please pause here for a bit and remember this color coding. The first thing to consider when you are writing a paper is to know your audience. There are two types of audiences that you are writing a paper for, and the first type is the reviewers. So these are the people who will first read your paper and decide whether it is worthy of publication. When you submit your paper to a conference or a journal or a workshop, the editor or the track chairs will be sending your paper to the reviewers, and they will evaluate it and take a decision. So these reviewers are aware of your domain and the problem. So when they are selected, most of the time, they are selected from the experts in the field, experts in the domain, people who know about what we are talking about. And some of them might even be working on the exact same problem. So their understanding of what you are talking about is very high. And their objective is to determine whether your work is worthy of publishing. Once you get through this step and the reviewers accept your paper, you submit the camera-ready paper, which is the final version of your paper. And the target audience of that is the general research audience, researchers who are interested in this type of work. So they might range from novice to expert. There might be people who are just beginning in this particular field, or maybe there are people who are experts in this field who will be reading your paper. Therefore, you need to strike a delicate balance between being too preachy or being too complex. There may be people who have a general interest on the topic. So there may be people who are not from your domain who will be reading your paper as researchers. Some of them, again, might be working on the exact same problem. And maybe there are some people who are just reading it to gain knowledge in the specific domain. So you should write your paper in such a way that it shows your contributions and your importance to the reviewers, but on the other hand, it's not too complex, too needlessly complex for your audience to understand, and also not too preachy. The second thing to consider is to follow the template. Most of the time, conferences and journals will have their own templates. They derive this from whatever the publishing body that they are connected to. So if you are publishing in a IEEE conference or a journal, they would be following the IEEE format. Sometimes they might be following the ACM format or ACL format, and so on and so forth, depending on the field of specification that you are working on. Therefore, when you are trying to write a paper for a certain conference or a journal, you should download the template from their website, because there might be small differences that they have done on top of the organization template. So when you are submitting to a IEEE conference, there might be small changes in that template that is not in the generic IEEE format. And once you download it, you should very carefully read the instructions. And you should very strictly follow the template. If it is MS Word or any other type of word similar program, even the open source ones, it is a daunting task that will test your word processing skills. But if you are using LaTeX or latex, depending on how you pronounce it, the formatting is automatically done for you. The learning curve of LaTeX is a little high on the beginning end, but once you have a grasp of it, the formatting becomes trivial for you. And in many cases, not following the template might result in a desk rejection. A desk rejection is where the editor or the track chair reject the paper without even sending it to the reviewers to measure the technical merit of it. So it is very important to follow the template so that your paper would not face such a fate. The next important point to look at is the paper title. The paper title should reflect your work. It is the one sentence summary of what you are doing, basically. It should indicate your contribution to the wider knowledge field, wider field of science, and so on and so forth. And it is okay to have two-part titles, where one might be a catchy sentence and the second one might be a technical title. So as you can see, Quality at a Glance is a catchy title which might speak to anybody. And then An Audit of Web-crawled Multilingual Datasets is a technical title which shows what this paper is about. However, you should try to keep it short and simple. As you can see, you might think that these titles are long, but in this particular subject, in this particular one, these are very short and simple. So keeping it to at least at most 2 lines in whatever the format of your paper is usually acceptable. One important thing is, do not promise things that you cannot deliver. The rest of the paper should deliver what your title promises. Moving on from the title, we arrive at the abstract and keywords. An abstract is a synopsis of the entire paper in about 150 or 200 words. So this is a generic idea that we are giving. In particular conferences and journals, they give the exact limits that they expect. Sometimes they might be higher, sometimes they might be lower. Again, not adhering to the number of words in the abstract might get a text reject. Here you should be very concerned about things such as hyphenated words. You might consider hyphenated words as a single word, but it is possible that some conferences or journals might consider them as separate words. So in that case, you might exceed the number of words. So be careful of how you count the words. Now, what should be in your abstract? You should cover everything that is key to your paper. The content of the abstract should be 1/3 the introduction and the motivation to the problem. The middle 1/3 is how the problem is addressed, and the final 1/3 is the key results and the conclusion. As you can see, it's like a mini paper. It's the summary of the entire paper there. So you might think, okay, that means I cannot write this in the beginning, and you are correct. We will discuss that later on as well. Usually it is better to wait to write your abstract until you have a good idea of what your paper is. And after the abstract, we have keywords. This is present in some types of papers, some formats, and in some cases they are not there. So if you do have keywords, it's a very powerful tool to tell people very briefly what your paper is about. So you can mention the key concepts that your paper deals. You can actually pick these keywords from the related papers as well, so that you would know that on one hand that you have selected the relevant related papers, and on the other hand the important keywords or important topics of the field has been selected for you. In certain paper listing sites, these keywords are the only things that are used to list your paper, unless they are using some machine learning system. So it is very important that you pick the correct types of keywords. The fifth item of consideration is the introduction. The introduction is not a chapter of a book. So you need to keep it focused. Most of the readers that will be reading your paper would have an idea about your topic and its significance. So there is no need to give minute details on axioms or very basic ideas that everyone should know. A good motivation on why your problem is important is a important thing to mention. You should show what other people have done and what is missing, and that particular missing thing is what you are filling in your paper. You had to describe the paper's contribution. Remember, we talked about this when you were discussing research proposal writing. Similarly, you have to clearly describe what you are doing it, what are the key results, and a rule of thumb is that somebody else who is writing a literature survey reading your paper should be able to just take this paragraph and plug it in to their literature survey to show what you have done, what you have considered, and what is the problem you are solving. Also, what is the summary of your results. Here you can briefly introduce the rest of the paper. You can say section X does this, section Y does that, and so on and so forth. The introduction section should use less than 20% of the paper's space. At the end of this presentation, we will look at some guidelines, not rules, of how you can decide how to break the paper into parts, but keeping it less than 20% is guaranteed success most of the time. The sixth item on the list is related work. In related work, you will be discussing all the literature that is related to your work. So this can move between the idea of related work and background on what are the seminal work and the most basic work. So it is easy to recognize the seminal work in your particular field because they will have a lot of citations already. And it is okay that sometimes this seminal work might be a little old, depending on each of your fields. What is old depends, and it can change. In certain very fast moving fields, old would mean 3 to 5 years. And in slow pacing fields, it might also mean 10 to 20 years. Either way, you have to pick the seminal works in your related work. And on the case of recent work, the count of citations might not be able to give you an idea because if they were published about a year or two ago, they would not accumulate many citations. But in some cases where somebody does a very important groundbreaking work, even very recent work might have a lot of citations. But in this place, when you are picking more recent work, it is completely up to you and your understanding of the field to select the most relevant and most recent work. It's your job to then critically evaluate them, to compare and contrast. Remember again from our previous lecture about writing research proposals. Those rules also apply here. Again, you have to illustrate what is missing between all of this related work. And very one important thing is that do not take their paragraphs and paraphrase, because that will lead to high similarity score and you might get slapped with plagiarism records. So you need to write your own paragraphs where you describe what these people have done, what other people have done, compare them, contrast them, write with your own words. You do need to justify that your work is important as well. It is vital that you say what the other people have done, but also you should use one or two sentences to say why your work matters in the context of all the things that you have just mentioned. And here, it should not go more than 10% of the entire paper. So, unless you are writing a survey paper, do not give too much space to related work. Now we come to the arguably the most important place that you get to shine, your solution or methodology. You will be explaining your proposed solution. It is better if you can be using a formal definition of the problem rather than just writing a passive paragraph of the problem. You should explain how you came up with the solution. How did you synthesize with other work? How did you come up with your assumptions? What is the logic between your solution? How did you derive it? And it should follow a logical flow. You can draw diagrams, draw algorithms, write algorithms. So drawing algorithms would be a flow diagram, and writing an algorithm is writing it down as words. You should compare your solution with the related work. You should give credit to the related work that you mentioned earlier. You should give enough details such that another person can replicate your solution. That is very important. Somebody else reading your paper should be able to follow your footsteps and get your results. Otherwise, you are lying, and that is a very big problem. Okay. Now we go to point 8, performance evaluation. So here is where you will give the experiments and the results of your work. You will be presenting the experimental setup. If you have an emulator, simulator, again, you should give enough details so that somebody can run your solution. You should show that you have enough data, enough samples, confidence levels, and the accuracy has to be reported. You can present your findings logically ordered, one after another, and sometimes you can have simple to complex as well. You can describe with graphs, tables, and findings. So findings would be just write-ups, so comparative analysis. Graphs and tables might be easier to read in certain cases. You decide what is the best way to report your findings. You should draw diagrams and tables. Simple and clear. There's nothing to gain by being obtuse. While in some cases it is vital to put color in your graphs, there exists a large number of researchers who still just print it in black and white and read it physically. These people are a dying breed. Most people have printers or read on screens, but still it is a good practice to either use black and white or grayscale, or just make sure whatever the color images or color graphs that you are putting in your paper would still make sense if you printed it in black and white. Do not put screenshots in your papers unless you are talking about a particular tool or similar. Unless it is a UI that you made yourself, unless you are talking about particular UI design, do not put screenshots. So everything that I say here, you might notice, might have exceptions to the rule. So if you are a person who's writing about HCI, as I mentioned, UI design, it's definitely okay to put screenshots about what you are building. If you are making a tool to use your system, your model, again, it is okay to have screenshots. But in general, unless you have a specific need like that, do not put screenshots. Part 9 we talk about is the summary. Summary is not the conclusion. So summary is to give a brief idea of what you have explained in the paper. While it is almost the same as what you would discuss in the abstract, do not just copy paste the abstract and change it a little. Make sure that your summary is distinct enough. You need to mention things like why your findings are useful. You have to recognize the limitations that you had, your assumptions, and you can point out future work. So the limitations that you discussed earlier can be future work. So this summary should not be more than 5% of your paper space. And at this point, we will also have the conclusion. So you can have a summary and a conclusion separate. Remember, those two are very different things. Point 10 is acknowledgement and references. Again, in acknowledgements, make sure that you strictly follow the given format. And you need to indicate any funding source if there are any. You can give credit to essential people who contributed to idea or the solution, and you cannot thank yourself. So the idea is, if a certain person's contribution was not on the research itself, so if you have somebody who did data annotation, copy editing, or sometimes even non-research coding, you can tag them here. They will not come under authors, they will be acknowledged here. And when you're writing the acknowledgement, sometimes in certain conferences and journals, if it is double blind, they ask you to remove certain parts as well in the original submission. So sometimes you are to not mention the funding source in the original submission, but you have to add it back when you are writing the accepted or camera ready version. This is because if they are using double blind review, they do not want to know who you are. And sometimes the funding source and the research grant numbers are a very easy way to know who you are. So be careful of what you are allowed to include and what you are not allowed to include in particular versions of your paper. In referencing, you need to use the proper referencing style. You can use tools that we discussed in the citations lecture to generate or convert citations. You need to double check the final output of references that you have. And again, if you are using something like LaTeX, it should be a very easy task to handle. So those are the 10 points that are essential for writing a paper. Now we will see what we can do on top of what we have here. You need to repeatedly do the spell and grammar check. Again, you can use special tools. If you are using online things, you might be able to use things like Grammarly or inbuilt word processing tools. Choose your words carefully. You do not need to use very jargon type words just to sound smart. But on the other hand, sometimes the generic words are too fuzzy to explain specific scientific concepts. So in those cases, choose specific relevant words to your study. The next step is the plagiarism check, and make sure that you are not plagiarizing anybody else's work, especially in the related work section. Remember, do not copy paste or paraphrase things. You need to write things yourself, even when you are just talking about other people's work. Proofread, which is a continuous process. Sometimes you need to stop writing, sleep on it, and read the paper the next day. Sometimes you might see things that you might have missed today. And you might give it to a friend or a colleague. And make sure that you select somebody who's willing to give hard and constructive feedback. If you select somebody who's anyway going to say a good work, that's not going to help you. So find somebody who is able to give critical evaluation and give it to that person, and that person will give you hard feedback that you can work. Once you have a good draft, you can send it to the supervisor, and the supervisor might point out various things that may be needed to be updated, and do that. Do those updates and maybe send a updated copy and so forth. So all of these for the initial submission. And for the camera ready paper, address the reviewer comments when and if they are. You can consult your supervisor on how to handle reviewer comments once you get them from your conference or the journal. Okay, now let's see why following these steps is very important, and what is the reviewing process usually. So usually reviewers are peers of you. They are researchers just like you, or just like your supervisor. These people are very busy and their time is valuable, and sometimes they even miss this, as I have put here. They might miss a deadline or two and be in a hurry to review the papers, and it is a easier thing to reject a paper than accepting a paper. For rejecting a paper, you just need to find some reasons and say, this is why I'm rejecting the paper. And those can be very short and sweet ones. But for accepting paper, you need to rationalize why you think this is a good paper for this domain and this particular venue. So, conference, journal, or workshop. So, let's see how a paper is going to go through the reviewing process with a single reviewer. So the reviewer would start and then see whether the title makes sense or not. If it doesn't make sense, reject. If it does make sense, they will read more carefully to see whether the abstract makes sense. If not, reject. Next, if it makes sense, again read carefully to see whether it is according to the template. If not, you guessed it, reject. If it is in the template, if it is according to the template, read carefully to see whether the introduction makes sense. If not, reject. If the introduction makes sense, they would read more carefully to see if the contribution is clearly stated. If not, reject. If it is clearly stated, read carefully to see whether key related work is discussed. If not, reject. So sometimes your paper might be rejected just on the grounds that you are unfamiliar with the things that other people have done, things that are existing. If you are reinventing the wheel, you are going to get rejected. Does the solution matter given the related work? Does your work contribute to the scientific understanding? If not, reject. If it does, we move on to the next one. Is the proposed solution understandable? This is why I said there is no point in making it obtuse and pointlessly hard to understand. If it is pointlessly hard to understand, reject. If it is reasonable, we move on to see whether the assumptions are okay and in line with the related work. You cannot write systems for spherical curves in a vacuum. Not, reject. If they make sense, we move on to see whether the experimental setup okay or whether it is using known parameters. Not, reject. Otherwise, read carefully. Does the graph and tables make sense? Are they well explained? You cannot just plug in graphs and tables. You need to explain them in your text. So anything that is not mentioned in the text are not going to count towards the contribution of your paper. They will just write table 1 is never discussed and just reject it. If they are, then you look at to see if the summary is consistent with the rest of the paper. If your summary is making grandiose claims that does not make sense with the rest of the paper, it's a reject still. And if all of these things have passed to the satisfactory level of that particular reviewer, then and then only will your paper get accepted. Right. Now let's look at one way to write a paper. This is not a rule, this is again a guideline. This is an idea on how to divide your time and effort and your real estate, honestly, on paper, because usually papers are given with a limit, 6 pages, 8 pages, 4 pages. So you have to be very careful what to put and what not to put. About half or more than that should go to your methodology. So you first decide that, and then you can go ahead and write first half of the introduction. explaining why is this problem important. Since you haven't done anything else yet, you cannot write the second half of the instruction talking about your solution. So you write the first half of the instruction. Next, you go ahead and write the first draft of the background. Here you are discussing all the research that would be important for this particular paper. And at this point in time, it is okay if what you have written for the background is 1.5 or 2 times the actual final length of the background. So if you need a 1-page background, it is okay at this point if you have a 2-page background or a 1.5 page. You can come and trim the fat later in the process. So don't stress yourself of writing a perfect background or perfect related work at this early stage, because when you are working on, you might find other things that are important, and maybe things that you thought important in the beginning might have to be cut off. So don't waste too much time at this point stressing over the limits and lengths and so on and so forth. Now, after this, you can draft your methodology. This is how you do the work. This is your methodology, things that you did for this problem. Then you do the experiments, coding, running, testing, tuning. And while you are doing this, this is programming. You might have to alter the methodology section until you are finalized with your algorithm, your methodology, your method. So now you can finalize your methodology section with the changes that you had to do with your experiments. You can write the results and experiment sections now. Now go back to your background section and reorganize it. Highlight the parts that were important in the methodology. Shorten the things that were not so important. Add things that are needed. And by the end of this step, the background section should be at the correct length. Once you are done with that, you can run the conclusion section. So the conclusions will include why the problem is important, what did you do, what is the research gap that you filled, and what is the results that you have. And now you can go back and write the second half of the introduction. It is basically a summary of methodology, results, and conclusion. And refine it again. The 11th part is writing the abstract. This is basically a summary of the entire paper or the entire introduction section. So this is a good guide that you can follow to decide what to write and how to write and when to write things in your papers. Here is a guideline on how to divide the amount of pages that you are given among the parts that you're writing. So these are examples from 2 of the papers that myself and my students have written. So remember, we try to put half the page count in methodology because that is what you are doing, and about 1.5 pages for introduction and abstract, 1 page for the background, 1 page for results and conclusion, and about half a page for references, to total of 8 pages. Similarly, if you have 6 pages, you can put 3 pages into methodology, about 1 page into abstract and introduction, 1 page into background, and 1 page into results, conclusion, references. As you can see, sometimes things are shared so that you can compromise within those divisions. The parting thought is, every paper tells a story. Know your story. Right? Tell your story. As mentioned earlier, these slides, some of these slides were based on the presentation by Dr. Pilambandaran, and I shall see you with the next lecture.